Any help sometimes. I'd be like, hey, one dude in my class. One of his friends said he would do like computer and business.
This is our College School of Business and Economics speaker series. We're very happy to have Virginia Postrel here with us, acclaimed best-selling author of The Fabric of Civilization, as well as The Substance of Style and The Future and Its Enemies, and a number of other books as well. Please take these books with you, and after her talk, I'm sure she'll be happy to sign them for you if you like. Please, everybody, help yourself to pizza and drinks. Don't want that to go to waste, you know. And it's lunchtime, so please take advantage. I want to thank particularly Professor Clemens for having us here in her class, as well as to everybody else who came. I want to acknowledge our sponsors, who are the Koch Foundation, which has paid for everything. In addition, I want to thank Greg, our advisor for Beta Alpha Psi, the Honor Society for Accounting and Finance, as well as Tim Scales, who's not here, but for Beta Gamma Sigma, the Honor Society for Business, and he's the advisor for that. So without further ado, here's Virginia Postrel.
Okay, so this is the book that I'm going to talk about today. And this is a book about the history of textiles that goes from 50,000-year-old Neanderthal string to people who are doing research today on the textiles of the future. But as you can see, it is a normal-sized book. It is not a library. So there were a lot of challenges to me as a writer in how I organize the book. But it's also challenging to give a talk. So I'd like to start the talk with a video I made before the book came out that serves sort of as a trailer that gives the big themes and some of real quick examples, some which I'll talk about in detail and others I won't. Now we had a little issue with the sound won't come through the speakers, so just be quiet. Let's do it.
I'm Virginia Postrel, the author of The Fabric of Civilization. My book is about one of humanity's most important and influential technologies, textiles. The word textiles comes from the Indo-European root tex, which means to weave. It's the same root that gives us the word technology. Textiles are such an old technology that we rarely think about them. They hide in plain sight. From the moment we are born, we are surrounded by cloth. We sleep among textiles, walk on them, wash, and dry with them. Textiles protect us from the elements. They carry our stuff. They help us celebrate. Textiles are everywhere. Textiles go to war. They keep us safe. And bandage wounds. They provide comfort and joy. The story of textiles is older than history and younger than tomorrow. It stretches back to cave dwellers twisting plant fibers into string, and forward to scientists embedding threads with computer chips. It is the story of human ingenuity in all its manifestations, artistic and technical, economic and cultural. The pursuit of cloth gave us germ theory. It led to the belt truck and the chemical industry. It built factories and finance. Textile traders spread the alphabet and Arabic numbers. Literacy, bookkeeping. They funded the Italian Renaissance and the Mughal Empire, the David and the Taj Mahal. The story of textiles is a story of commerce and culture, a story of peaceful trade and savage wars. The story of textiles is a human story. It's a story made by women and by men, by famous leaders and forgotten peasants. It's a story of art and science, of economics and religion. It's a global story set in every time and place. It is humanity's story. It is our story. Please join me in exploring the fabric of civilization, how textiles made the world. So, to make cloth, you first have to make thread or yarn. Because, what do I mean by that? You have to learn how to spin, and what that does is, by twisting fibers, what you're allowed to makes the fibers long and strong. Because if a fiber comes off a cotton plant or off of a sheet, it's little. And even the longest ones, which come from flax or linen, I'm talking about biologically based fibers here, they're maybe a foot long. So you've got to make yarn, you've got to twist it, and you've got to stretch it out. Now, fortunately, people figured out how to do this, and they figured it out in many different places all around the world, pretty much originally using this very simple technology, which is called a drop spindle. And it's basically a stick and a weight. Sometimes the weight's on the bottom, sometimes it's on the top. There are variations, but basically people all around the world figured out ways to do this. You load the fiber on the stick, you set the stick spinning, and you feed the fiber into it, and the weight keeps the angular momentum going, keeps it going. And you make string this way. Okay, so there's lots of pictures like these that I have here of women spinning, particularly in Western art. And there's a good reason for this, because this is what women did. You can find a picture of any kind of woman that you can imagine spinning. There are pictures of Greek prostitutes spinning. There are pictures of the Virgin Mary spinning. There are pictures of queens spinning. There are pictures of peasants spinning. There are pictures of the virtuous housewife, like this, spinning. There are pictures of the extremely flirtatious and racy young woman, single woman, maybe with a would-be lover hovering over her, spinning. Any kind of woman that you can imagine, you can find art representing her spinning. The reason for this is that this is what women did. All around the world, all the time, they were spinning. When somebody finally figured out how to use water-powered mills to grind grain, what did they do with the time they didn't spend grinding grain? Spin. Oops, what happened to my feed? Okay, the reason for that, hopefully it'll come back, but yeah. Okay, well, anyway, I can go on without the slides, at least for a little while. So the reason that women were all the time spinning is that it takes a lot of thread to make anything, and it took a lot of time to make that thread. So if you think about, one of the things I did is this chart. This will not be on the exam. If you think about the denim that it requires to make a pair of blue jeans, there's 6 miles of cotton thread in that fabric. I'm not talking about the sewing thread. I'm talking about the thread that's in the cloth. Before the Industrial Revolution, the fastest, best spinners in the world were in India. It would have taken one of them about 100 hours to spin that 6 miles of cotton thread.
which is the equivalent of 13 8-hour days. And that's just for one pair of pants. So you can imagine that clothes were very scarce, they were very expensive, and not just clothes. Talk about things that are big, like bed sheets. A queen size sheet, 200 count. This is like a street sheet you buy at Walmart, not super high, and it would have 37 miles of thread in it. Tremendous amount of time to do that, 75 8-hour days before the Industrial Revolution. Think about something really big, like a sail, which a Viking sail, spinning the thread for one Viking sail, just to spin the thread, took the equivalent of 385 8-hour days. That's just to get the thread. If you want to actually take the whole supply chain, so to speak, start with the sheep, because they made their sails out of wool. You got to pluck or shear the sheep. You got to clean the wool. You got to then spin the wool. Then you got to weave the wool. And the Viking loom is about yay big, which is why you get those stripes, because those are, you got to sew the panels together. If you want scary red stripes, you got to dye the wool. All of that took longer to build than to build the ship, to do all that, to make the cloth for the sail. Now, I will confess that I watched the TV show Vikings. I watched all 6 seasons of the TV show Vikings. The shipbuilder is a major character in that series. He's very innovative, he's an interesting character, he develops new ways of making the ship so they can go farther. In all 6 seasons of that show, there is one loom which is shown in the background of one scene. Because apparently the Vikings went to IKEA to get their sails. We don't think about sails. We just assume they're there because we don't think about textiles. Well, the Vikings didn't have that attitude. In one of their sagas, the only time in his life that one of the heroes cries is when somebody steals his sail, because then he's immobile. It's tremendously important, and it's a very valuable piece of capital equipment. Also, if you want to go on a raid, you need a sail. So we tend to forget about this. So think about 6 miles for a pair of jeans. Think about 385 days to make a sail. Then you start to see why the Industrial Revolution, which started with spinning machines, why the fact that it was spinning machines was a big deal. I mean, it is proof of concept. It does show you can mechanize and power a human process, and you get big productivity boosts from doing that, because instead of one person spinning very slowly, you get a whole bunch of one person watching over a whole bunch of spindles that are spinning very fast. Then you can get that idea, and you can say, oh, we could do the same thing with other processes. But it's not just that it's this proof of concept. It's also that it's spinning, because spinning was the bottleneck in the production of textiles. Before the Industrial Revolution, it took 20 to 30 spinners to keep one loom supplied. And often there weren't, even though all the women were spinning, often the weavers didn't have yarn, so they wouldn't be able to work. They wouldn't be able to make cloth because there wouldn't be enough yarn. The spinning machines broke that bottleneck, and therefore, all of a sudden, you have obviously more and more affordable clothes, household linens, but then cloth is also, particularly in this pre-plastic period, pre-steamship period, used for all kinds of important economic goods. So sails, I've talked about, sacks, all kinds of sacks for carrying things that today we might use a plastic barrel for, various kinds of belts and ties. It sort of ripples through the economy. And so this is one of the first giant productivity boost that propels what becomes the way to wealth in the world. One of the interesting things about human beings is they aren't satisfied just to have functional objects. They want to have, they want to give them aesthetic qualities that provide pleasure and meaning. This is a big theme in the Substance and Style. And this is a great example of this. This is a little piece of cloth that is 6,200 years old. It was found in a very, 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 very dry part of Peru. Now, 6,200 years ago, people were very poor. They were poor by any 21st century standards. They were living a subsistence existence. And yet, somebody went to a lot of trouble to not just make cloth, but to make striped cloth. And it's got 3 different colors, which you can see in the sort of computer recreation. There is a beige brown color, which is the way the cotton comes off the plant, because cotton is not naturally white. It was bred to be white to make it easier to dye. There is a bright white, which is a milkweed plant that grows in the area. And then there is blue, which is dyed with indigo. Now, indigo is a really, and this is the blue that's in your blue jeans, that's where we see it most often, but indigo is a really weird dye. It is a really weird dyeing process. First, you make an indigo vat. That's a whole process in itself, which I won't go into. But once you have the vat, you get this thing. It looks kind of like antifreeze green. The liquid looks like an antifreeze green, but you also have these bubbles, bluish, purplish bubbles around it. And you dip your cloth or your yarn in the indigo vat, and it comes out green. And then it turns blue in the air. Now, what's going on is this. This is the get the indigo vat slide. And this is the dip it in, turns blue, turns green, then turns blue. Now, obviously, 6,200 years ago, people didn't know this. In fact, 200 years ago, people didn't know this. But what's amazing is how far you can get just with trial and error. People figured out, and this is the whole history of dyes up to the 19th century, is how far you can get just with trial and error when you have good feedback. Because dyes are not like magic, they're not like medicine. You know, the cloth is either turning the color you want or it's not. You can do experiments. So indigo is a particularly remarkable dye because people all around the world figured out how to dye with indigo. So it's this weird process, and people figured out it all around the world. And they figured it out using different plants that are not even related to each other, but that happen to have the same chemical in them. So they figured it out in India, that's where we get the word indigo. They figured it out in Europe, where it was a dye that's called, a plant that's called woad. If you ever see a medieval tapestry, you may notice that the grass is blue. That is not because in the Middle Ages they had blue grass. It is because green is actually a really hard color to make using so-called natural dyes before synthetic dyes. And so in order to get green, you would dye with yellow and with blue. And indigo lasts forever. 6,200 years ago we have indigo. Indigo rubs off, that's how you get the patterns on jeans. But it doesn't fade into wash, it doesn't fade in the sun, and so we have these medieval tapestries that you can still see the indigo, but the yellow has vanished, and so the grass is blue. They figured it out in Japan. They figured it out in Southeast Asia. They figured it out in various parts of Africa. And of course, they figured it out in Peru. All around the world, people figured out how to dye with indigo, how to do these very complicated chemical processes. And the archaeologists who worked on that, on the textiles from that Peruvian excavation, he says in the modern world, we sometimes think of ancient people as primitive with a lack of understanding about the world, but really you had to be pretty smart back then. One of the things that I have become appreciative of having researched textile history is that in every time and place, there are very smart people who can figure stuff out. No matter how far back you go, no matter where you go, there are very smart people. Maybe not everybody, but somebody. Somebody's smart enough to figure out indigo or figure out how to spin or all these other things. He's wrong, however, to say that to equate being smart with having understanding, a lack of understanding about the world. In fact, we collectively do have a much deeper understanding about the world than the people who were dying in indigo 6,200 years ago. We know about, oh, I did it again, what's the deal here? We know about molecules and oxidation, which is what's happening when the indigo turns blue, and eventually we figured out how to synthesize dyes. And the first example, people tried for like 100 years with no success, but the first successful person to make a dye using chemical science is this fellow. His name is William Perkin, and actually he looked nothing like this picture when he did it because he was 19. He was a chemistry student in London. He went home on Easter vacation. He brought his chemicals with him, set up a little lab table in his parents' home, and there was this waste from making gas for lamps called coal tar. And it was just an industrial waste. And he was trying to take this industrial waste and turn it into a very important anti-malarial drug called quinine that you could only get from a plant that was expensive and hard to get. So he does his experiments, and it's a complete failure. He doesn't get quinine. He gets this random black powder. For some reason, he thinks, well, what would happen if I took this random black powder and dissolved it in denatured alcohol? So he does that, and boom, it turns purple. Oh, purple. So he's living in a society where the textile industry is a big industry, and he thinks, purple. I could maybe turn this into a dye. I could start a company. I could get rich. You know, the entrepreneurial thoughts. So he does his due diligence. He talks to somebody in the business. He says, suppose I turn this purple stuff into a dye, would there be a market for it? And the guy says, absolutely. In fact, there would be a big market for it because we have okay purple dyes for wool, but we don't have any good purple dyes for silk and cotton, and that's what a lot of people want to wear. And by the way, purple is having a fashion moment. It's very fashionable at the moment. So yeah, go make your purple dye. So he sets out to start his company, and like many entrepreneurs before and since, many I've talked to in my career as a journalist, if he'd had any idea how hard it was going to be, he probably wouldn't have done it. Because it turned out to be super hard because basically he had to invent chemical engineering. He not only had to develop the equipment and the processes to make the dye, which on commercial scale, which is not the same as doing it on a table in your parents' house. He had to develop the equipment and the processes to make the ingredients to make the dye. But he succeeded, so he does the experiment in 1856. Takes him a couple years, but gets the company running, and it is very successful. He calls the stuff Tyrian purple after an ancient, very valuable dye, but that name doesn't catch on. It becomes known as mauve. And pretty soon, mauve is everywhere. There are satirists writing about mauve measles because everybody's wearing mauve, and other chemists get the idea that they could use his techniques and start dye companies that make other colors. So pretty soon you have this profusion of color in fashion and also of chemical companies hiring chemists. And once you're hiring chemists to make dyes, then you think, what else could they do? So they make medicines, Bayer aspirin. Bayer started as a dye works. They make glues, they make explosives, they make photographic chemicals. There's a whole industry, which all starts with dyes, and eventually it wraps back in the early 20th century, in the 1930s, to making synthetic fibers and plastics. So I have this picture of this purple and black dress, which was one of the inspirations that I saw it many years ago in a museum, and in an exhibit on color and fashion over time. And when I saw it, I thought, wow, that really changed the way the world worked. Like, I knew synthetic dyes were important in the history of business and industry, but I hadn't really thought about how these vivid colors, and it's not just the purple, it's also the black. Black is really hard to make, like a deep black like we're used to. It's really hard to make with plant-based dyes and minerals and stuff. And so once we have synthetic dyes, we not only get the chemical industry, we get a whole different looking world of textiles, because there's many more colors and they can be much more intense. So the moral of the story is the history of dye is the history of chemistry. It's the history of how far you can get just using trial and error without any fundamental scientific understanding, and how much farther you can get when you do have that scientific understanding. So in honor of you, I don't usually put this in my talk. I do other things. I want to talk about traders and merchants. The sort of oldest merchants, or the oldest traders, are textile traders, or dye stuffs. And you may have been taught in school, Columbus wanted to go to the Far East because people wanted spices, and that's true. They did want spices like nutmeg and cloves, but a lot of these spices were actually dye stuffs. They were lumped together, and medicines. But anyway, so textile traders are the oldest long-distance merchants, and in fact, they're certainly the oldest long-distance merchants that we have records of. There are just like tens of thousands of these cuneiform tablets. They're 4,000 years old, and they are letters and business records recording the trade between, this is the woman, French woman who translates them, between a town called Assur, which is near Mosul, today's Mosul in Iraq, and a town called Kanesh, which is like, I forget, it's like 900 miles away, so it's far, which is in what's now Turkey. And these letters are amazing. They're fantastic because they're very personal. There's one where a wife is writing she's back home in Assur, and she's like running the textile manufacturing, so to speak. She's getting the cloth made, and her husband is in Kanesh, and he is the guy who sells it. So it's the inside guy and the outside guy, or the inside woman and the outside woman. So it's a classic clash between husband and wife, and also between business partners. Because what she writes in the letters, first she says, so-and-so is bringing this, spinning textiles, and so-and-so is bringing this, telling what deliveries to expect. But then she goes, like, why do you keep complaining about my textiles? I'm sending you good textiles, but you complain about them. And then I think it's in a different letter. There's like, sometimes you say they're too dense, and sometimes you say they're too loose, and make up your mind. And it's the old thing, like the outside guy says, why don't you make what I can sell? And the inside guy says, why can't you sell what I make? A similar kind of thing. So this is our earliest records of long distance trade are these 4,000-year-old cuneiform tablets, and most of that is about the textile trade. So letter writing, later in the Renaissance you get development of postal systems, obviously literacy, and one of the things about in Assur was there was widespread literacy, like the women could write, practically all the men could write. They weren't dependent on scribes. All of these things are what are called social technologies. They're not technologies like a gadget, but they're things that make other work possible. Social technologies is the concept. And another example of social technologies is money. And by which why do we have money? Well, money works much better than barter, because you can I can, you can buy my book and then I can go out and buy my Diet Coke supplies. And you don't have to trade me Diet Coke for my book, which if you're not the Coca-Cola company might be a problem. So people invent money. They invent it in a lot of ways, a lot of places, and often they use gold and silver, copper, also some metal, because there's certain characteristics you want in money. You want it to be something that's portable. You want it to be something that's storable. You want it to be something that can have standard denominations, so that, a gold coin weighs this much, it's worth this much. A silver coin of the same size is worth less, but you can have $100 bills and $1 bills. You want to be able to have useful denominations. And ideally, you want to keep the money supply matching the size of the economy. It's simplifying, right? You don't want to have inflation, and you don't want to have deflation. You don't want to have too much money chasing too few goods, and you don't want to have too little money chasing too many goods. Not a problem we have today, but that has been a problem at certain times in history. Well, it turns out if you don't have easy access to metals to use as currency, in the pre-industrial world, textiles work really well. And there were at least three places where they were widely used as textiles, as money. One is in China. And in China is and always has been a very top-down place. So in China, the government established a certain type of silk, certain weave, certain size bolt, and this is the weave, and it said this represents X number of copper coins. This is currency. It's not barter, this is currency. You can go and you can say, here's a bolt of silk, I want to, buy a bunch of rice, and the rice merchant can take the bolt, and then he can go to the potter and say, here's a bolt of silk, I want to buy a bunch of pots. It's currency, it's money, like we know money, it's money. You can pay your taxes with it. In some cases, you're actually required to pay your taxes with silk. So the Chinese government, this is all in the Middle Ages, the Chinese government establishes the standard bolt of silk, and everybody understands how many copper coins it's worth. Copper coins are rare. Silver coins are even rarer before the Spanish get to South America and start exporting silk to China. So silk makes a good currency. It's in China, and it's a currency because the government said this is currency, legal tender. You have to take it. Elsewhere, it wasn't the government, it was just the merchants who said, we need money, we need a form of currency, let's use a standard bolt of cloth. So Iceland has like nothing. They have like no wood, they have no metals, it's just rock. Very beautiful, but it's, so they developed a specific weave of wool, a specific length, and it became their currency. And this was bottom up. People started doing it because they needed something to trade with, and then over time the law caught up with it. So you could settle your debts with this standard bolt of cloth. You could, you could pay your taxes, you could pay your tithes to the church, all of these different kinds of things. And the thing about whether you're talking about the silk or you're talking about these bolts of wool in Iceland is when I talked about you don't want inflation or deflation. Okay, this is in the pre-industrial world. Remember when the spinning took forever and weaving also took long. Okay. Cloth is scarce. It's a limited supply. So therefore, if you start to get inflation, first of all, you're less likely to get it because cloth is scarce. But if you have too much cloth chasing too few goods, then you just turn it into clothes. And you turn the cloth into clothes, and the money supply shrinks down to what you need. If you don't have enough, you have too little money chasing too many goods, then you get going at your loom and your spindles and start producing more money, more currency. And this also happened in West Africa. Many of you have probably heard of kente cloth. That's one type of what's called a strip cloth in West Africa, and this is places like Ghana, Nigeria, all along the West Africa coast. They have traditionally made what are called strip cloths. A strip weaving. They weave little 4 to 6 inch long strips of a standard length, and then they're sewn together into a cloth, and it requires a lot of planning and precision to get it so, like in this case, it's a very nice one, so that you get the squares to line up right. And also, if you're talking about kente cloth, it's much later, it doesn't come around until the 19th century, but you also have to use a special kind of loom. But, so they do these strips, and then they sew into a big cloth, and then you wrap the cloth around your body like a toga, you know, many kinds of traditional garments don't cut the cloth. Okay, this is perfect for making money. It has all the characteristics I was talking about textiles, and maintain the money supply, but also it comes in strips. So there's your lower denomination is the strip, and your higher denomination is the whole cloth. And so instead of making a super fancy cloth like this, you would make a simpler cloth that would be used as currency. And this was used as currency to trade between West Africa and across to what's now Libya. So there was a trade going back and forth there. And again, sometimes people would just turn it into clothes because the clothes were more valuable than the money, but it could also be used as standard currency. So another really important social technology is money. The Renaissance, we see these famous paintings in museums, and if you look at, I selected these two specifically because they show a lot of elaborate textiles. And this was, as I said in the video, the textile trade is what funded the Italian Renaissance. I mean, people were making a lot of money finishing and making really expensive, really luxurious materials. So the textile business is a huge business in Renaissance Italy. It's the sort of leading industry, if you will. It also spawns a lot of banking. And there's some really important social technologies that come into play. First of all, those merchants in Italy in the Renaissance, they adopted Arabic numbers and the Hindu 0. Now, think about trying to do your taxes or keep your books using Roman numerals. How hard that would be. When this idea of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 0, and you can do this, came into Europe, the first people who adopted it were these Italian textile merchants. And they also started schools to teach people, their kids, basically, how to do arithmetic. And all of these techniques that you learned in elementary school, how to add, subtract, how to line it up, somebody had to invent those. How you, not a mathematical concept of addition or multiplication, but how do you set it up? If they teach you how to multiply large numbers in 4th grade or whatever, somebody had to invent that. So this was kind of developed in this period, and people started schools which were primarily for the sons. Sorry, they were discriminating against the women, the girls of the textile merchants, because they wanted them to be able to track the money and also to do various kinds of foreign currency conversions, because every city had its own currency. And the books, there are a lot of these handbooks that were used in the class, in the textbooks basically. They're mostly word problems, and most of the word problems are about textiles. So here's some examples. These are actual examples that they would give. If 8 bracia means arms. Literally that's the word for arms, but it's a unit of cloth, are worth 11 florins. What are 97 worth? And then they have 20 bracia cloth are worth 3 lire, that's a pound, bigger denomination, and 42 pounds of pepper are worth 5 lire. How much pepper is equal to 50 bracia of cloth? Oops, I said I have a typo, but anyway. So they learned how to do arithmetic using all these word problems, and these are some of the easier ones. There are other ones with foreign currency which are really hard, and a lot of those involve textiles as well. And then, as was mentioned in the video, this is also the period where double entry bookkeeping is invented and adopted. And again, the textile trade in Italy is where they particularly adopt it. And this is, suddenly you can keep your books in ways where you can actually figure out kind of what's going on in your business. So there are lots of these examples of things that developed out of trading with textiles. There are bills of exchange, which are very complicated, which is not why I'm not going to explain them, but they were a way of writing down on paper so that if you were trading, you didn't have to send like sacks of gold over the Alps where they could be robbed. You could exchange letters basically with banks. So I want to end with consumers, with the end users. My chapter on consumers is about how people want textiles, and they want the textiles they want. They want the textiles to mean what they want them to mean. They'll go to extreme lengths to get the textiles they want. Some of those lengths are, waging war. They're very brutal. Some of the lengths are very defiant and brave, political. Some of them are creative. And I want to show one last video about one of the more bizarre instances of this.
To introduce this video, I've come to Hollywood, to this Cannabis Before Prohibition era. It's appropriate because this is a story of prohibition, of what my shirt and my bandana have in common with marijuana and marijuana dispensaries. Our story starts in the 1600s, around the time the British colonists were settling what would become the United States of America. Back then, if you were European, all the textiles in your life, clothes, your bed covers, your curtains, your cushions, your tablecloths, whatever, were probably solid colors, with maybe a few stripes, plaids, and checks thrown in. If you were rich, you could embroider them with silk thread. If you were very rich, you could buy brocades with patterns like flowers or pomegranates woven in through a laborious, very expensive process. But if you just wanted a floral summer dress, you were out of luck. In the 17th century, that changed. Merchants began bringing in cotton prints from India. They were amazing. The cloth itself was super soft, woven of incredibly finely spun threads. It was cool in the summer, it was easy to wash and dry, and it made great underwear, much better than linen. And then there were the colors, reds and blues, purples and pinks, greens, yellows, and browns. They were gorgeous, and unlike the dyes Europeans were used to, they didn't fade in the wash. Europeans went crazy for calico. They turned the exotic prints into wall hangings and bed covers. They made them into ladies' dresses and gentlemen's robes for lounging at home. They turned them into easily laundered baby clothes. Everybody loved calico. Everybody, that is, except the silk industry, and the wool industry, and linen and hemp. They were aghast. They demanded protection from the calico competition. Save our jobs, they told their governments. And in many places, the governments listened. Some taxed the imported fabrics. Others banned them altogether. France went in for prohibition, supersize. It banned calico imports, but it didn't stop there. It banned all cotton imports, even of plain fabric with no design on it whatsoever. And it banned all prints, even prints made in France by French companies using French-made cloth. France's prohibition was not just anti-foreign, it was anti-cotton and anti-print. The silk industry was running the show. For 73 years, 1686 to 1759, France treated calico essentially the way the United States treats cocaine. But the prohibition never worked. The demand was insatiable. If you were willing to take the risk, there was big money to be made in the calico trade. Smugglers brought in the forbidden cloth from countries like Switzerland, Holland, where it was legal. Or they got it from the French East India Company by lying about their intentions. They claimed they were going to take it to Africa to trade for slaves, which was okay with the French government. And then they turn around and sell it in France or its colonies, which was definitely not okay. The French government kept ratcheting up the penalties. Traffickers could be sentenced to years pulling oars in the Navy's galleys. The worst offenders were put to death. Ordinary people caught wearing calico could be arrested and imprisoned without trial. During a crackdown in 1730, a young Parisian was caught standing in the doorway of the wine shop where she worked. She was arrested for wearing a jacket with red flowers. Another woman was on her way to the butcher's when she was busted. Her crime, a jacket with brown flowers and red stripes. The fashion police peeked into windows. They saw people wearing calico in the privacy of their own homes and hauled them off to jail. But the French refused to give up their calicos. Aristocrats even wore them to the court of Versailles. Madame de Pompadour, King Louis XV's mistress, loved them. Calico prohibition turned countless French citizens into criminals. Enlightenment thinkers began to argue that the ban was not merely ineffectual, but unjust. One asked, will our descendants be able to believe that our nation was truly as enlightened and civilized as we now like to say, when they read that in the middle of the 18th century, a man in France was hanged for buying in Geneva at 22 sous what he was able to sell in Grenoble for 58. Prohibition was lifted in 1759 and replaced with a 25% tax on imported calicos. Finally free to buy cotton cloth from India, French entrepreneurs developed their own printing technology using copper plates. A new industry was born. Inspired by Chinese porcelain, they created the patterns we now call toile, like this t-shirt. So the next time you put on a flowered dress or a Hawaiian shirt, or buy printed pillowcases for your bed, or a printed face mask to keep from spreading your germs, remember the ingenious Indians who gave us calicos, and the defiant French who broke the law to wear them. Thank you. So we end at 12, is that right?
We actually have till 12:15.
Oh, okay. Anyway.
Does anyone know, is there a class after this one?
Yeah, there is.
Okay, so we have to be there.
Yeah.
It's at 12:30.
Oh, it's 12:30, so, okay, as long as we're out by 12:15. So I'm happy to take any questions, which don't have to be about specifically what I talked about. I mean, I want to talk about textiles, don't ask me about, the football or something, but I'm happy to take questions. We also have books, I'm happy to sign books. Yeah.
How did you start your career and what kind of led you to researching textiles?
Okay, so those are two very different questions in terms of time, because I've been writing professionally for more than 40 years. And I started by working on my school's newspaper and then sending out those clips. I don't recommend this, by the way, in 2024 as a career path, but sending out samples of my writing. I got an internship. I mean, it's kind of a traditional way into journalism. I was a journalist, a writer and editor for a number of years before I wrote my first book, that came out in 1998. That's the orange one, Nutrients Enemies, and then I've written 4 books altogether. So it's not like I write a book every year, but I really enjoy writing books because you get to dive in deeper. The trick is you have to find something that you want to live with for years, because there's lots of subjects that are interesting enough to write an article about. But you not only have to spend all the time that it takes to write the book, then you have to do things like this for a couple, well, in this case, because of the pandemic, even longer than a couple years, go around and give talks and stuff. I got interested in textiles specifically. I'm interested in the intersection of commerce, culture, and technology, among other things. And over a really pretty long period of time, it was probably like 15 years, I would go to a museum and see an exhibit like I saw this exhibit where the purple dress was. Or I would hear a scholar give a talk, like I heard somebody give a talk about calico prohibition. It was actually her dissertation was on calico prohibition. And I would like file it in the back of my head. This sounds really interesting. Like maybe someday I'll write an article about textiles and technology. And then in 2014, somebody told me that the Textile Society of America, which is an organization primarily professors and museum curators, although anybody can join it if they pay the money, they were having their big conference at UCLA, which is about a mile and a half from where I live. And she said, you know, Virginia, if you think you might ever write about textiles, you should go to this conference. So I went to the conference and I heard some really interesting history papers, archaeology papers, 18th century papers about people and, you know, production of textiles and you know, used clothes markets in the 18th century, all this kind of stuff. This is really cool. I wrote an article and there was interest in a book when it came out. It took a while before it turned into, before I was ready to write a book. And also I first did a proposal that emphasized contemporary textile production, like, you know, innovations that we're having today. Take it around. The way it works in this type of publishing is an agent, and the agent shops your book, sends it, your proposal to a bunch of publishers. The feedback we got was, we like this, but we really want more history, which I was happy to do because I really like history, but it was much harder because there's like a whole lot more history, and so figuring out what to put in. Yeah.
Ships. I know, you know, like one of our major sources of knowledge about them is from the Bayou Tapestry. You know, it gives us knowledge about Norman and British ships of the later era,
Yeah.
like they were based on Viking models, what
Right.
they thought they had been. But in particular, you know, it's like most of what we know about Viking ships are from ships that were specially constructed to be buried for Viking chiefs. Were sails ever buried with them, or do we not know that because they let it decay?
Yeah, to my knowledge, we don't have, I mean, there are, so I spend a lot of time in Scandinavia because there's actually a Center for Textile Research at the University of Copenhagen, and it's primarily, it's archaeology, but it's not like ancient, it's, you know, kind of Viking era archaeology. And there are, I don't know of any sails that are preserved. I think it's been reconstructed. I mean, people do a lot of sort of experimental archaeology, it's called, you know, they'll use the technique. Interestingly, the weaving techniques that were used, which is a drop, it is called a warp-weighted loom. It's a standing loom. It has like rocks tied to hold the threads in tension. They were used up until the 1930s in Scandinavia. I mean, ancient Greeks used similar looms. But so there are, they are well documented what the loom process was. And there are most textiles that continue to exist, you know, that are ancient textiles, or like the one from Peru, they are in very dry places. Like the oldest textile was found in a cave in Israel. It's about 9,000 years old. But there are places in Europe where there are bogs, where you have anaerobic conditions where textiles are preserved, and some of the older sort of Viking textiles are like that. But to my knowledge, they don't have sails. There've been some sails have been pieces of sails are believed to be pieces of sails that are found in Egypt. I know those are the oldest ones I know of. There's I want to say 15th century, so later, British ship that has some sails preserved, as well as other textiles like stockings and clothes that were part of the cargo that have been studied. Somebody have a question? Yeah.
You said the Future and Its Enemies was done in what, 98?
98, yeah. Oh, it came out in 98, so it was, researched.
How much is?
Well, the interesting thing is, so obviously, if you were to read the book, I mean, a lot of things, specific examples have changed. I mean, this was the early days of the internet. There was no social media before that sort of thing. In fact, I don't even think Google existed. No, it didn't. So there's specific examples, but actually that book is having kind of a resurrection. People are interested in it now because a lot of the political dynamics that it talks about have been happening recently, partly because what I was describing, so I'm describing this, the instead of traditional left and right, you get alliances over issues like trade that are combining on both sides. They combine elements of the left and right and elements of the left and right. And what happened was after 9/11, a lot of that got blown up by foreign policy being the sort of the lead, and the alliances becoming more traditional, and also to some degree identity politics, but particularly foreign policy, which is, I mean, that book is not about but now people are looking at, ideas about regulating tech, what do we think about AI, a lot of things that are where the ideas are relevant, although the examples are, ancient. They're from the previous last century. Yeah. Yes. I did weave my scarf. Did you dye it? I did not dye it. It's made of tensile lyocell, which I like to weave with because it's very soft, and it has beautiful colors, but it's a whole lot cheaper than silk. Yeah. Yes?
Technical question about the calico. Is that woven in? I mean, those are very...
No, they're prints.
They're prints.
They're prints, and I actually took a workshop in India where I learned the technique. I mean, I'm not saying I could do it without supervision, but there's this guy who's really brilliant, a master printer, but this school gets him to take away time from his workshop and teach foreigners. And the way it's done, they have blocks and that you dip in the dye, but it's done in stages. So the first thing you do, you start with a plain, like muslin, plain cloth. First thing you do is you have a resist. So you start, you use the blocks to put down this resist so that no dye will go in those places. So ultimately that's going to be the color of the background fabric. Then, if I can remember it correctly, you use, to make other prints, where you want red, you put on what's called a mordant. Red dyes, and again, I'm talking about pre-synthetic dyes with red dyes. Before you can dye with red, you have to soak the fabric or the yarn in a solution with something, it's called a mordant, that comes from the Latin word that means to bite, that will make the dye adhere. And the most ancient and still frequently used by people who do natural dyeing is called alum. It's a certain kind of mineral salt. So we put alum, a solution of alum on the places where we wanted red. And so then we dye it with red, and the red would only adhere there. And then the final thing was indigo, which went just everywhere else, and then you wash it a lot to get the, and that was a relatively simple because that's only using three colors. They also painted, and still do. All right, oh,
In your studies in fabrics, this kind of popped into my head when you were talking about, well, it was the women who made the fabric, made the clothes.
well, it's the women who spun. I'm interrupting you, but this is worth clarifying. Everywhere in the world, women were the ones who spun and men didn't spin. I mean, today you will find men who spin. Like I took a workshop from a guy from Peru, and he had learned to spin from his mother. But everywhere in the world, women spun and men didn't. Weaving is different. Some places women weave, like in China, there's a saying, men till and women weave. The weaving was done primarily by women. In Europe, it was mostly done by men, at least in the early modern and Middle Ages. And there are some places, specifically places in Africa, where women weave on one kind of loom and men on another. So that's, anyway, so that's.
So it prompted just a member from a class a long time ago, and somebody was talking about the role of women in very nomadic societies where when they weren't working with cloth, they were working with animal skins and that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. And that women were given the responsibility for chewing on the animal skins to soften them. Mm-hmm. And that one of the reasons that early women did not live long besides childbirth was that with all the chewing that they were required to do to make the fabric for clothing and shoes and that kind of thing, to soften the teeth would wear away.
I know nothing about that. I didn't do leather. I didn't do leather and fur. I mean, there, you know, the big challenge with this book was what to leave out. That was an easy call because I don't consider, there are people who consider leather a textile. I don't consider it a textile. But I also didn't write about carpets, which is a whole other thing. And I didn't write about tapestries, which are, I mean, many of the things I wrote about would apply to tapestry because, like, they were made out of silk threads or wool threads, so anything about production, yeah.
So yeah, what I thought was if they did that, did they also have to chew the fabrics to soften it?
No, it's fabrics are intrinsically soft. I mean, they don't require they have to be cleaned. If you're doing cotton, you have to gin it one way or another. You have to get the seams out. But to my knowledge, I can't think of anything where maybe very early linen, you might have used a little spittle on it, but it wouldn't be chewing. All right, thank you.
Please help yourself. And also to the books.
So all of you in my class have noted your attendance for today. Be aware of that. You'll have to be in here. Thank you. Yeah, I don't know. Talk today.